You'll have to forgive me, class, for coming to you remotely. It seems my office and anything in its close vicinity has been overtaken by Players Tournament, the famous golf tournament that happens in Northeast Florida every year. So this entire week has been crazy and difficult to find any quiet space where I could actually record my video. I've been reading your work with interest and been wanting to react and also wanting to give you some preparation for what I know is a most interesting assignment. I've also been involved in some very interesting assignments myself, namely a big article that has involved everything that you have been reading about and learning about this week. So let me jump right into it. In the Kovac text, you have been reading about the who journalists write for and the journalism of verification. Interestingly enough, both of those topics were incredibly important to a specific article that I gathered information for actually over the past few months and actually began writing probably a week ago and finished up just Thursday night, actually Tuesday night, and then published on Wednesday. So I'll get into that in a little bit. I did want to mention in the Kovac book, though, when we're talking about who journalists write for, it's incredibly important to remember that when you are writing for the citizenry at large, or if you're writing for a special interest journal, or for any journal that's angled in a particular way, say NASCAR, that you are remember that you are writing for the constituents that that purchase the magazine or that have a vested interest in what's going on within that special interest group. Those readers, those citizens that you're reacting to, that is who, as a journalist, you are responsible to. Oftentimes, journalists get led astray in thinking that they're responsible to their advertisers, their publishers, the people that pay the bills. And that is very easy to think that way when those people, and even governments, when those people threaten or coerce or intimidate journalists. But that is huge in what we see around, what we've seen forever happening. And it's imperative that journalists maintain a degree of objectivity, but also distance from the people that pay the bills. And it absolutely depends. Journalism depends on people being able to do that and not live in fear, but instead to have courage in their reporting and to have ethics and know that as long as they're doing the truthful thing and as long as they're looking to minimize harm and they're not going about personal vendettas, but being able to get the information out there, then they can rest in that. And at times it does mean a job. Unfortunately, for some people, it's even meant their lives. As we look even in what's happened in the Middle East and those colleagues and journalists who have paid the ultimate sacrifice for news reporting. But that is what good journalism is all about. When you look at the journalism of verification, that's where the credibility factor comes in, and that's where as prospective journalists, you can take comfort in the fact that if your journalism, if your work is verified, if you have gone the extra mile to check out the information to see whether it's factual and true, whether you are credible, then you can rest in that. Certainly in the last few days after a big piece that I work on, I can rest in the fact that my journalism, my information has been checked out. I am credible. And if anyone would like to argue that with me or discuss that with me, then they have hardly any merit on which to stand. So with that said, I'd like to tell you just briefly about Well, let's briefly go through your other text, and then we'll talk a little bit about the story that I worked on and how it relates. Because I know sometimes when you see things in a text, it's hard to also relate to a particular story or something that might be going on in the world. So if you look at your other book, Inside Reporting, um, page 23, or actually page 22, in the third chapter, there's a really good, actually a comic book strip on how news stories are put together, how a story gets written. And in this story, Jenny Deadline, we've got a young woman who's on deadline, and she was either looking for a story or a story came upon her. One of her professors wrote on the biology professor wrote on the chalkboard or the dry erase board, "I quit." Nothing more, just "I quit, Professor Siegel." So she decided to do some investigation on her own. And this is a very good comic strip because it really does show how she queried different people. She got their comments, got their remarks, and that is the basis of what happens when you begin to put together a story. You have an idea, you have a thought, and then you go about trying to put together some information, whether you gather the information on the internet, whether you ask people, and usually it's a combination thereof. Now, I would say one of the things that didn't ring true in Jenny's story is that rarely is the human resources department of a college or any institution going to share any personal information with you, such as a letter of resignation or so forth, because that is usually confidential information. So in that, I was a little bit of a warning bell was going off in my mind. That wouldn't happen probably. So that was an interesting aspect that I looked at. But certainly when we go through the steps of that entire comic strip, and if you haven't, I would encourage you to do so, the question at the end was there was some suspicion, some rumors that the professor had resigned under pressure or so forth because he had been involved in some kind of a sex scandal or gotten a student pregnant. Now, in her original story, Jenny did turn this comment in. Siegel refused further comment, leaving some students to speculate that he had quit to avoid facing a sexual harassment complaint. Now, the editor, when the editor got back with Jenny, told her that he had taken that out. Now, one thing that points out is that people need editors. Unlike self-published blogs and other particular, even Facebook entries or social media, Twitters or Instagrams and so forth that aren't edited. That's one of the differences between journalism and just self-published things that you can pass around and talk about. The incredible importance of editing and a good editor that can help you out and maybe stop you with experience from doing something that you won't want to do. The editor pointed out that that had not been substantiated. Well, it turns out the question in the text was that good? Could they have been sued for libel had that been printed? Because it turns out that that particular professor quit because he had won the lottery. Well, absolutely. That professor, if you take a communications law class, you'll discover, could possibly have sued the paper for libel. Now, they could have claimed, well, we didn't know, but not knowing is not necessarily a good defense, or saying, well, somebody else said. Spreading rumors and innuendos is not necessarily a good defense. They did not have proof. They did not have definitive information. They did not have a police report or allegations thereof that he had been accused of sexual harassment. So therefore, to print that in a newspaper that has a value, in other words, those words are in print, would be inappropriate, at least unethical, maybe in the middle, and absolutely perhaps illegal, and would open that paper up for defamation. And maybe even slander. Those two are different, but definitely might be the cause of a lawsuit. So you want to be very careful in your reporting, that you're reporting facts. And even if you're reporting what people say, it is on you to check it out, because that is something typically that's easily verifiable through a police report or other information. So you don't want to report speculation of that nature, because that is a criminal act, sexual harassment. Okay, so next in pages 24 and 25, again, there's some very good information on how a story flows through the newsroom, how the news actually comes together. That is very good information. It talks about how reporters work together to get the news together, how it flows through editors, and how it finally ends up on the page of a newspaper or in a broadcast or podcast, or however it's put out to the public. I did want to point out particularly small newspapers and online newspapers, such as the one that I manage and I'm executive editor for, and I also write for, can be sometimes problematic in the sense that there's one person that might actually write the news, edit the news, publish the news, take pictures, and do a lot of work behind the scenes, in addition to running the newspaper and editing everybody else's work. Particularly when there is a large story that involves investigative work and that involves a good nature of high-profile individuals. Now, I told you I was going to tell you a little bit about a story that I'm working on. The headline of the story that I released on Wednesday night is Southern Baptist State Leaders accuse a missions organization of strong-arming. Pretty weighty information. This story took place over, well, the collection of the information for this story took place over the period of at least 2 months. For this story, I interviewed 5 state executives, Baptist state executives, which Baptist state executives on the world front would be compared to governors of states. Say we had regions in American life, those would be like governors of states. So state executives for Southern Baptists would be closely aligned to the people that I interviewed. 3 of those people spoke to me on the record. The other 2 spoke to me on the record, but asked for anonymity. Now, why would that happen? Well, because what they were accusing an agency of, that they partnership with and work in cooperation of, was strong-arming them and putting gag orders in an agreement between them to partner together. So, if they're strong-arming them and giving them gag orders, meaning you can't talk, how willing do you think they were to talk to me? Not very willing, because that was the point of the story, that this mission agency had asked them to not talk. In other words, close your lips, don't be transparent about what may be happening or what kind of support that you're getting, for various reasons, for all sorts of reasons, so that there's not a lot of competition, so that they can move ahead with their strategy, not necessarily for bad reasons or anything. It's just that it's a different approach than it had been in the past. And so some of these state execs and some of the people within this organization and outside of the organization, all throughout the Southern Baptist Convention, feel like this is not correct. There's also one gentleman in the story who was fired from his state convention after he resisted this kind of behavior. And he says it is closely aligned to, or it is because of his resistance, that his livelihood, his position at his convention was threatened, and ultimately his position, he was ousted from his position because the people in his state were threatened that if they did not end his position, that he would be fired. That they would not receive money from this organization to be able to continue to do the kinds of things that they do. So there was a lot going on with this story. So as you can imagine, I went about this story very carefully, documenting, collecting information, making sure that people meant what they said, reading things back to them even, just making sure that all of the information was very factual. And in as much as when I finished the story, I had a trusted friend who's also been an editor, who is an editor still of another well-known paper, look it over and bounce ideas off of him to say, is this solid? What do you think? Is this a good idea? So all of those things are what go into a solid story. How do you craft a story? How do you start? How do you begin? Well, I think way back to when I started as a news writer. A good example is the best teacher. A good example is the best teacher. Look at stories that interest you. Look at how they start. And I'm talking articles, stories, not first-person pieces like things that you find on blogs. I mean, look at news stories, New York Times, the LA Times, news stories. News stories are timely. News stories are important now. They're not going to be important a week from now, 2 weeks from now. News stories that's what we're working on this week. They're stories that are important now. They can't wait a week or 2 or 3. And they need to be up to date. They need to be less creative than, say, a feature story. The creativity that you put into a news story is how you can make it flow, what transitions you use between quotes. And don't bury those quotes. Notice in good news stories how the quotes are at the beginning of a paragraph. They're not buried in a paragraph. And note that your paragraphs are short. It may be 1 sentence. It may be at the most 2. Very rarely is a paragraph more than 2 sentences in a news story. There's a good old-fashioned reason for that, and that was because if you looked at a column in a newspaper, those columns are they're not very wide. And so if you had a very long paragraph, it would take up an entire 4 or 5 inches of a column, and it would be way too long for your eyes to follow. Now, on the same token, people are reading things now on their mobile phones, on their iPads, on their iPhones, on their smartphones, on their iPads. And so people don't want to have to go on forever and forever with a paragraph. They want to be able to go from one paragraph to another to another. So this is not essay writing. This is journalistic writing. This is news style writing. So yes, your grammar needs to be very good, your punctuation on par, but your writing style, your paragraphs will be much different from an essay where you start out with a kind of an introductory lead and talk about what you're going to talk about and then talk about it and then talk about it again. We don't do that in journalism. What we do is use the transition will be how we go to the next paragraph and the next paragraph and the next paragraph. We move it along with our eyes. That's how we get our readers to go to the next step. We don't keep restating ourselves and restating the information because the readers will not stay with us. And you know that because you're the reader. You read a lot. If you're a journalism student, I certainly hope so. I certainly hope you read a lot. And at this point, I hope you read a lot of news stories because that will really help you. And I hope you read them from good newspapers, award-winning papers, because that will give you an idea of what is good, what is well written. Read the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Read the New York Times. Read the LA Times. Very well written paper. And I'm being biased because I like the LA Times. I'm not saying that you should read those papers for their angle of whether they're liberal, whether they're conservative, and that sort of thing. Look at how stories, however, are crafted. Look at how the leads start, how the lead goes then right into the first paragraph that may be a quote. Don't start with a quote. It's an exceptional story that starts with a quote, and that's usually a feature story, something that's very creative. So for a news story, look at how those news stories are written and follow that example. A good example is the best teacher. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to call me, text me, email me. My information is out there. I don't want to hear an excuse that the time difference is going to mess you up, or that you're concerned about me being in Florida and you being in California. This is a small world. We're out there on digital media, social media, and everything all of the time, so we can make up for any time differences. And you can reach out to me, and I'm here at the end of that telephone, text, email. So, good luck. I'm hoping that you'll take these words, use them well. I know that this particular video came a little later than I would have anticipated, but I'll record another one very shortly that you'll have by Monday to get started on your next week. And I wish you a happy weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.